We're going to continue in this chapter this morning, but we're not going to finish it. There's too much here to finish. And in fact, there's probably 2 more sermons in this chapter before we finish this chapter. But we're here in this chapter. We've come to the end of Jacob's life, where he's sick in bed, and he's literally on his deathbed, and he's sharing his final words. So these words are words that are important. They are what he wants to share to his sons, and ultimately their descendants, as being what is the most important thing. So these are instructions and blessings for life. We saw immediately before this, with the ending of chapter 47, we saw that God's promises were fulfilled, specifically in the 2 dreams. And the second dream was fulfilled in 47, where implicitly in 46, but explicitly in 47, where his father and thus all the descendants were bowing before him. And we saw that promise of God being fulfilled. And in that next chapter, chapter 48, where we see the overall story narrative of the preparations for Jacob's parting, we saw him specifically have a private meeting with Joseph and his sons, where he's blessing Joseph. And he's doing that by adopting his 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, as his own, and thus to give them each an equal portion of the inheritance of the land, and thus giving Joseph the double portion, and thus the firstborn privilege, the firstborn blessing. And in that chapter 48, he gave a blessing in words to Joseph's 2 sons, and thus to Joseph. And he separated that. And then in this chapter, we have the words that he's given to the rest of them, the rest of the 12. He actually gives words to Joseph himself as well, but that was a private, special blessing just for Joseph and his 2 sons in chapter 48. And I bring up the note about the promises of God being fulfilled for Joseph in these 2 chapters, because when Jacob is making these last and final words, he's actually starting to give new promises to each one of the 12. And because we've seen the promises of God being fulfilled in this narrative, when we see these prophecies here in this next chapter, chapter 49, we see that they're actually creating new promises. And we as the reader, especially the original readers, are fully expecting those promises to be fulfilled in the future and looking for it. And just like in Joseph's, it took many years, and it was through avenues and means in which no one expected. The same thing here. The point of these promises is that these things are sure, they will happen, and we just need to keep our faith in God and continue in light of these promises and knowing that they are going to be fulfilled. And when Jacob is giving these words, in chapter 49, the text specifically introduces them as being prophetic words. This is information that God has prophetically and specially revealed to him, and thus he's called his sons in and he's sharing it. These are not just words out of the blue. These are information that God has given him. And so number 1, they are a prophecy of things in the future. And then number 2, they're also words that share examples or patterns in which his sons and their descendants are supposed to follow. These are the ways of God. Specifically how he said, hear and listen. Repeating those 2 words in parallel phrases earlier in the introduction of this passage, specifically of not just hearing with the ears, but hearing and thus obeying. So through all of these, we're looking for a prophetic element, what's going to happen in the future, but then also a applicational element. How can I, as part of God's people, learn from these instructions and how to live or how not to live? And so these words to these different sons really become general proverbs for life and for living in this world. Last week, we looked at the words to the first 4 sons. We had the words to Reuben. Reuben, his name means, look, a son. He was the firstborn son, and he had a privileged position, preeminent in authority and in strength in the family, and then he blew it. And that responsibility that he had and the trust that was given to him was taken away. And the prophecy is that he wouldn't have it anymore. And the lesson to learn, the example was that for those who have that privileged position of authority, in whatever sphere it is, whether it be you're an older brother, or you are a boss, or you have a head of state, or whatever, is to treat that position as a gift and not to abuse that power, not to use it to bring harm or bring dishonor, but to use it to bring good and to serve. The second words were to Simeon and Levi, and they're the only ones that are grouped together. Simeon means heard from God, and Levi means to be joined. And thus there's a little play on words there because those two brothers joined together to do what was actually evil. They are condemned for not having controlled their anger, and thus they use their anger and their connection, their brotherhood, to produce violence. And then their curse was that they would be scattered throughout Israel. They wouldn't have land to call their own. And it gives us a negative example, but by twisting it over, making it a positive example, it encourages us to encourage one another towards godliness and holiness, and not to be a force that brings each other down. And it clearly shows that we shouldn't be taking revenge and bringing about more wickedness. Justice is one thing. Revenge and wickedness is another. And then finally, Judah, whose name means praise, said that it was a prophecy of blessing that he will be praised by the rest, and that a king would come from him who would be victorious over Israel's enemies. The king would reunite the tribes under one, and then he would usher in a time of blessing. Now that looked towards the future, towards David, but ultimately towards the Messiah, towards Jesus. And the lesson here was that opposed to Reuben, who abused his power, here a godly rule would bring about safety, security, and blessing. So this morning we're going to continue our study to look at the parting words of Jacob, part 2, verses 13 through 21, where we're going to consider Jacob's words to the next 6 sons. So that by the end here we'll finish 10 sons, and then I'll leave off Joseph and Benjamin for the next time we get together. So first, the next son that Jacob addresses is Zebulun. Now it's interesting, he's going out of order here. This is the first time he went out of order. He did Reuben, who was the first, and Simeon, and Levi, and Judah, 1, 2, 3, 4. But now he skips over Issachar and goes to Zebulun, who is the 10th son that was born to Jacob, and the 6th son and last son born from Leah. And why is this out of order? I don't know. Some commentators say that Zebulun played a more major role in Israel's history, and that's why they moved that out of order, but it really doesn't seem to be any clear indication that I can see. So let's see the words. In verse 13 it says, Zebulun will dwell at the seashore, and he shall be a haven for ships, and his flank shall be towards Sidon. So notice here, opposed to the last 4 sons, there's nothing about his character. There's nothing about his history that affects these parting words. It's just seemingly talking about his dwelling. But here there's a play on words a little bit with his name. His name, Zebulun, means to dwell, or specifically to dwell in honor. And here it says, so the one who dwells in honor will dwell. It's a different word for dwell, but the concept is the same. And he will dwell on the seashore. Now, in this verse, there's only 3 lines, and there are 2 major difficulties with these 3 lines. The first difficulty is in the first 2 lines, where it says that Zebulun will dwell at the seashore, and he shall be a haven for ships. Now, the big problem here is, look where Zebulun is. Not on the seashore. And he won't have a haven or a harbor for ships. So obviously, the tribe of Zebulun, the land that was allotted to him by God, is landlocked. And in fact, it's about 10 miles any way you go towards the sea. And this is the land that was allotted by God in Joshua 19, 10 through 16. Now, some commentators have addressed this problem by saying that the word for dwell refers to a temporary dwelling in tents. and that before they allotted all the land, well, there was a brief time where he did actually live by the coast. But there's no evidence of this. It's better to see these words and translate them literally. When it says a seashore, literally the Hebrew says toward the coast of the sea, simply meaning a coastal region. And in the second line, if you see in the New American Standard at least, it has shall be here in italicized, meaning it's not really there in the Hebrew. They're adding that for helping you to understand. It's probably not the best interpretation or translation that's going on there. It literally should have a parallel function. So literal translation that'll help us understand it would be something like this. Zebulun will dwell toward the coast of the sea, and he will dwell toward the coast of ships. Now in Hebrew, it's literally the coast of the sea and the coast of ships. These two words are the same, and they're parallel, and they're meant to be seen as parallel. And there's supposed to be a repetition in order to focus on things coming from the sea. And when it says the coast of ships, it just simply means harbors, ports. So, as you can see, from the side here in Israel, there are not many towns that are by the coast. In fact, in ancient times, most of Israel's coast lacked natural harbors. It just didn't allow for them. So there's very few harbors on the coast of Israel. And towards the north, the northern region is starting from here upward. That's where you have the majority of harbors or natural harbors where they could have them. So we need to then ask, what do these words mean? What is this blessing? What is this prophecy? Well, to ask first, what benefit would a coast or a harbor have? Trade. It has trades, imports. And so what he's saying here is that this tribe, these people of Zebulun, will benefit from sea trading. Now, it's hard to see, but there's a road that's traveling right here that goes right through Zebulun here and down here. That is a major highway, north-south highway in ancient times. There was two. There was this one and there's one towards the other side. But this is known as the Via Maris, or by the sea. It's a major highway where people did trading, specifically coming from the coast and coming from ports and going down south. And this passage, interpreted as we're interpreting it as being that Zebulun will benefit from the coast and from imports, is something that Moses will prophesy again in Deuteronomy, where he says in Deuteronomy 33:18, of Zebulun he said, "Rejoice, Zebulun, in your going forth, and Issachar in your tents. They will call peoples to the mountain. There they will offer righteous sacrifices, for they will draw out the abundance of the seas and the hidden treasures of the sand." So what Moses was saying in Deuteronomy, that these two tribes here will bring trading people in to trade with them, the riches of the sea and of the coast. So that's the first issue, the first difficulty, is understanding that the first two lines are speaking about the trade, that they will do business and have great trade and wealth coming from the imports from the sea. The second issue is the third line, where it says, his flank shall be towards Sidon. Now, Sidon is a city that's located way up here. Obviously, it is a coastal city. It is a major coastal city. But it's way up here, and Zebulun's territory is way down here. When it talks about his flank, it talks about his border, his furthest border. But as you can see, the furthest border is here. Sidon doesn't even border any of Israel. Now, in order to understand this, and to clarify and to help this with this apparent difficulty, there's two factors that we need to consider. Now, one, historically, when Joshua led Israel out of the land of Canaan, he did not conquer all of the land. He didn't drive out all the people. If you look at this map here, the lighter color is the territory that Israel had after Joshua. So you can see there's a lot of other area that wasn't, even when we're talking about Zebulun here. And the second factor is Sidon is a major port city for the Phoenicians. And the Phoenicians ruled land and territory that would be all in this area. And they are sometimes called Sidon. They're known by that city. Just replacing it, and thus Sidon a lot of times refers to a people group, a city, or even a region, referring to the Phoenicians. So I'm going to overlay on this map the territory of the Phoenicians, and let's see where it happens. It goes right over, and now it's at the flank or the border of Zebulun. So, speaking of prophecy, what the prophetic message that Jacob is communicating is that Zebulun, his descendants, they're going to have an important business relationship with the Phoenicians and from all those that are coming into their ports and traveling down the major highways, bringing on all the treasures and all the imports from the sea. And what can we as God's people hear and listen with these words? How is it going to benefit those others that are coming after him? Well, what it's communicating is that this is saying that we as God's people can and should be interacting with and benefiting from the world around us through business, through trade, and that we are not called to be isolationists, but people who are in the world and having dealings with people. Okay? The message from the next son are words to Issachar. Verses 14 through 15. Now, Issachar is the 9th son of Jacob, and he's the 5th son born to Leah. So with Issachar, we'll cover all of the sons, specifically from Leah. And the message in 14 starts off by saying, Issachar is a strong donkey, lying down between the sheepfolds. Now, when it says strong donkey here, I know it's clear as mud, right? It's literally saying here, it's strong-boned donkey. That's the idea here. And what that would communicate to you is that it is a strong worker. It's made and bred for hard labor. But, unlike its purpose, it's lying down. It's lazy. It's stubborn. Or it's possible that it's exhausted from hard work, but here it's probably emphasizing that it's lazy. And it's stubborn. It's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. And that word for sheepfolds there is a rare word. It's only used here and in Judges 5:16. In both contexts, it's very difficult to know what the word is meaning. If it is if it's referring to a sheepfold, it would be referring to people groups. God's sheep, God's peoples. He would be in between basically two tribes. And thus he'd be sheltered from the enemy. The word sheepfolds there in Hebrew has a dual ending, which means two. But if you look, Issachar's here, he has 1, 2, 3, 4 neighbors. So there's not 2 sheepfolds. If you're going to say anything about sheepfolds as far as tribes, it'd be at least 4. So that's probably not the best translation or understanding. Now this word can also mean saddlebags, which fits a donkey perfectly. It has 2 saddlebags, one on each side of it. And saddlebags were used for labor. You're not riding the donkey per se, it's used to carry things. And thus, he's lying between the saddlebags, which refers to the burden of labor, and hence drawing out the stubbornness and laziness of these people. And the name Issachar means wages. So here you have a further play on words with his name. Issachar, who is rewards and wages, who is strong and made for labor, for hard work. He's lying down in between the saddlebags when he should be moving them and working. And the idea here is that Issachar is a strong animal, made for labor, but he's resting, and he's resting before the work is finished. And the work here that was supposed to be finished, that he had to do, that all the tribes were told to do, was to remove the Canaanites And if you can see, Issachar's here. This is his territory. And if you can see in this map, it has a big Canaanites right here. They were still there, right there in the land. And the reason why they're there is because if you can see this darker patch of green here, that is a valley. That's what's known as the breadbasket of Israel. It is an extremely rich land where they grew crops, specifically wheats and grains. And this is where a lot of Issachar's land is, right in this area where the richest place for growing crops is. So you can obviously see that is a very valuable piece of property. And thus the Canaanites were there, and they never removed them all. So thus you're going to have problems. Verse 15 goes on to say, when he saw that the resting place was good for crops, it was fertile land, and that the land was pleasant, he bowed his shoulder to bear burdens and became a slave at forced labor. So his resting place, that's where he was allotted, the land that was allotted to him. It was good, it was pleasant, it was great for crops, it was fertile. And thus he bowed his shoulder, meaning to carry a load onto it. It could refer to the shoulder or to the back. But it refers to hard labor, hard work. And thus it says they became slaves to the Canaanites that lived there. And that word there for being enslaved and for bowing the shoulder, that's used of the enslavement in Egypt. So the very slavery that they were released from, these descendants of Issachar are going to go back to it. They're going to be re-enslaved. And thus this is a curse on Issachar because he didn't finish the task that God had put before him. God had told them to remove the enemy, completely remove those people, and he didn't. And those people eventually took advantage and enslaved them. So the prophetic message is obviously a curse. It's a sad curse and a sad state that Issachar will be enslaved. The moral lesson, the thing to learn, is that we as God's people have to finish what he's commanded us or instructed us to do before we rest. The different areas in our life where we have sin or we have something that we're supposed to do, if we don't take care of that, that will then harm us later, possibly enslave us later. God's people cannot rest until the task that God has put before us is finished. All right, this brings us to our third son, which is words to Dan. Now here we see the first time this is a son from a handmaiden, or one of Jacob's concubines. This is from Bilhah. It's the fifth son of Jacob, the first son from Bilhah, which is Rachel's handmaiden. And the text says, Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a horned snake in the path that bites the horse's heels so that the rider falls backwards. For your salvation I await, O Lord. All right, going back to the beginning here, Dan, the word Dan means judgment in Hebrew. And it's judgment, so there's a play of words there because the one who's called judgment shall judge over his people. Now his people referring to not the tribe, that's self-explanatory, it's all of Israel. He will have a time of judging over them. And a judge, to have a judgment over them, means that you have a responsibility of defending the rights of the weak and easily oppressed members of society. And someone from Dan will judge over the Israel as one of the tribes of Israel, meaning he won't be a king, he won't have a higher place, but he'll judge them as being an equal within the tribes. Not his tribe won't go ahead and be preeminent over the others. So he won't be an elevated position of a king, but he will have the position of a judge. And so this person that will come from Dan shall be a serpent in the way. It's not someone that's going out and seeking difficulties or harm or fighting, but it's one that is there ready to defend when attackers come in. It says that he will be a horned snake on the path that bites the horse's heels. Here we see the cunning defense of this snake who defeats the horseman. Basically, it bites the heel. That bite is so powerful, the horse goes up, the rider falls, and it's done. Battle is over. So it's that cunning, the wisdom of staying put and knowing when to attack and attacking forcefully, that cripples the enemy. Now, in Jewish tradition, this is referring to Samson. And in Judges 13:5, it says that he shall begin to deliver Israel from the hands of the Philistines. And looking at Dan and his history and what was going to happen, this fits perfectly. And I agree, this is referring to Samson. Samson is, as a judge, he defends the rights of the weak and easily oppressed members of society of Israel from the Philistines. And because God will raise up Samson to do this, it implies that Israel will have a future where they are weak and where they're vulnerable. And we know from Judges that this is during a time where they are worshiping other gods and not being faithful to God. And because this, being a judge, implies that, we see this prayer here. Notice it's an I, for your salvation, I await, O Lord. This is Jacob. This is Jacob interjecting his own words into what's being prophesied. And he does that because he sees his future descendants as being vulnerable and needing someone like this. And so he prays, asking God for his deliverance. And he says, for your salvation, your deliverance over these people, over the enemy, I wait, O Lord. Knowing that salvation and deliverance, that only comes from God. And without him, there is none. So we can be certain here that this is Samson for a couple of reasons. Number one, when Jacob says, for your salvation, I await, that word there is the same word for as judge, as deliverer here. It means to deliver from the enemies. And that was Samson's purpose, and that was Samson's point. And secondly, we can be fairly certain that this is Samson because although Dan was allotted this portion of land here, they couldn't settle in it because of the enemy. And shortly after the time of Samson, they had to relocate to this speck of land up here, literally to one town. So the tribe after Samson didn't amount to anything and had really very little history outside of the book of Judges. So, speaking prophetically, these words prophesy that there will be a coming warrior from Dan who will deliver Israel from their enemies and judge over them. And in Samson, God began to deliver Israel from its enemies. And what we saw in 1 Samuel is that David was the one that actually completed delivering Israel from the enemies. But that started in Samson. And so the point here, the moral point to hear, to listen, the example, is that this small tribe can deliver a nation. You don't know who or whom God will use to impact our lives. He could use us. He could use you. And God's deliverer is one that acts wisely in defense, wise as a serpent. But just as Jacob's words proclaim, it's the Lord who actually is the one who's delivering through his people, giving them wisdom, giving them that strength. And separately, as a side note, outside, looking from the outside in, we see when the first time when Jacob sees a problem, Jacob goes to prayer. And that's a great example for us as God's people. Whenever we come up with any kind of problem, any kind of need, bring it to the Lord in prayer. That should be something that's a natural, normal part of our everyday life. It should be our first response. Because ultimately, our salvation, our deliverance, it comes from the Lord, and we need to wait for him. It doesn't mean we don't do anything, but we need to wait for his deliverance and to be dependent on him, praying out to him, calling out for him. Okay, the next son is Gad in verse 19. Now, Gad is the seventh son of Jacob and is the firstborn to him by Zilpah, which is Leah's handmaid. And verse 19 says, as for Gad, raiders will raid him, but he will raid at their heels. The word Gad means good fortune, which is somewhat ironic because he will continually face raiders, people coming in and trying to steal and pillage the towns within his territory. And the word that for raiding / good fortune is emphasized here because this whole verse is one long pun. There are 6 words in Hebrew that make up this sentence, and 4 of them use the consonants in Hebrew of G and D in English, Gimel and Dalet in Hebrew. And so it looks like this. As for Gad, so the 2 consonants there for Gad, raiders, Gadud, shall raid, Gudna, and then, but he will raid, Yagud. And it plays on those sounds, and it's all coming from the same 2 consonants which make up the root of Gad's name. So it's emphasizing that they will continually be in struggle. And why is that? Well, if we look at where they're located, we have the foreign country of Aram, of Ammon, and Moab. So we have the Moabites, the Ammonites, and the Arameans that are all around him and will constantly try to raid and take over. But the second line says, he will raid at their heels, meaning he won't just sit there and let them take it. He's going to defend his people. He's going to go right back after them. And when it says he could raid at his heels, it means that he's going to go after them and be victorious. Because if you're on someone's heels, that means they are running away from you because they're defeated. So he will be victorious, showing the strength of his warriors. And thus that's a good thing. But he's not going to have a life of peace. There's going to be a constant struggle there. But the Lord will bring him victory. So the prophecy is obvious there that in the coming days they're going to have a difficult life there, being on that side where his allotted territory is. He's going to be surrounded by enemies, where he'll be in constant conflict, in constant war. In much the way God's people, have always lived, in constant struggles. Even us, as God's people, we are surrounded by enemies, and we constantly are living in struggle. And so the thing to listen, the thing to hear, to obey is just like Gad. God's people need to be on guard and be ready. And be ready to defend against those who invade, those who are coming to do harm. And we don't fight back for vengeance or to promote wickedness, but we do it for justice. We seek justice through the means by which God has provided. Now here, there's no authority structure over the nations. It's one nation against another. But in our society, God has put us under authority, where we can go to bosses, police forces, government, those who are in control over justice and injustice. And we need to use that systems to bring about that. And in fact, in the church, in Corinthians, it talks about if it's a conflict between 2 believers, we're supposed to use the elders of the church to bring about justice. And we know from Romans that government in general is a minister of God, a deacon of God, to bring about social justice, to punish the evil of those who do wicked and to praise those who do good. But here, this is encouraging the believers to seek out justice. The next son is Asher. This is Jacob's 8th son, and the second born to him by Zilpah, which is Leah's handmaiden. And to Asher he says, as for Asher, his food shall be rich, and he will yield royal dainties. Now Asher, the name Asher means happy. And it was the name that Leah gave him because when her handmaiden bore Asher, she was happy. And now in this prophecy, the descendants of Asher are promised to be happy and to have a prosperous existence. When it says that his food shall be rich, it refers to an abundant crop, both in quantity and quality. This food will be rich. It will be the best that the land has to offer and to be produced. And in fact, it's going to be so good, it's going to be, he's going to yield food that's good enough for royalty. It's food that's fit for kings. And thus it shows it's the best of the best. And this area is known for rich soil, and it's good for olives and for vineyards. So prophetically, this text is simply saying that in the times to come, they're going to be blessed with abundant and rich crops, wonderful crops. And so much so that they're good enough for kings. And the moral example, the pattern of their life that we can learn from, or God's people can learn from, is that these good crops, the provisions, they come from God. They come from the Lord. And the things that the Lord gives, the provisions, the crops, the food, that should bring us happiness. That should bring us joy. I love how Ecclesiastes talks about working with your hands and the fruit of your labor. Enjoy them. God's given you them to enjoy Him, enjoy your family, enjoy the fruits of your work. That is part of the reason why you exist. That's part of Solomon's wisdom in Ecclesiastes. It goes right along with this words of prophecy here in blessing. Then finally, we come to Naphtali. And Naphtali is Jacob's 6th son and second born to him by Bilhah, which is Rachel's handmaiden. And to him it simply says, Naphtali is a doe let loose, and he gives beautiful words. The Naphtali the name means struggle, my struggle specifically. And here we see the opposite of his name in these words. It says Naphtali is a doe let loose. He's not struggling, he's loose. And a doe, which is a deer, a female deer, it's known for its speed, for its agility, for being nimble. And it's often used as messengers, as words that describe messengers who go throughout Israel proclaiming messages. And here it's let loose, it's set free, it's set out, it's going out through all the territory. And the parallel line here of giving beautiful words means it's a doe, it's a messenger that's going out fast, nimbly, and giving good reports. It's proclaiming that God will bless their tribe. So the prophecy is simple, that God will give them many blessings to report, good news to report. And what can we learn from their pattern or from these words? Is that the good things that God is doing, the blessings that he's bringing, the victories that he's bringing, these are things that need to be shared among his people. I know in our family, when we homeschool, they're reading some biographies from missionaries. And it's amazing to hear them, to read those stories and to hear how God has blessed them. It's encouraging. It's encouraging to hear what God is doing in other people throughout time and throughout the world. That he is working and he's doing amazing things. And we, as God's people, need to hear them. And we, as God's people, need to share them. That's an important part of encouraging one another. Okay, so we've come to the end here. So let's go back, and I want to reword and reemphasize the applications. Okay, number one, from the words of Zebulun, we see that God's people are encouraged to interact with and benefit from the world around us through business. We're not called to be isolationists, to be completely separate. And this is how we get our ministry. If you think about the majority of your day, it's spent at work, typically, and you're around other people, and it's the main sphere in which you interact with non-believers, where they can see your life, and you can, just by your words, your behavior, glorify Christ. And then, through your words, can share Christ and share your faith, who you serve and why. And that happens through business. Okay, number 2, from the words of Issachar, we are admonished to finish the task God has set before us before we rest. Failing to fulfill God's instructions will have negative consequences. Now, specifically in their case, it's the enemies that were left in the land. But in general, that's exactly the case. If God has told you to do something and we do it 50%, well, the rest of it that's still there, it's going to produce harm, and it's going to get a foothold. Okay, number 3, from the words of Dan, we see that the small tribe can be used by God to deliver a nation by being wise in defense like a snake. Let us be wise in our dealings and ready to defend against those who mean us harm. Not seeking out to do harm, but being ready to defend. Okay, number 4, and I think that's what Jesus was referring to in part when it says, be wise as serpents, but innocent as doves. You don't cause sin, but be wise as a serpent. And if it needs to be defending, to bring about justice and safety, to love the people that are around you, then that's what needs to happen. That is also why Jesus told them after he left, when in preparation for his leaving, he said, carry the sword. Not to use it as an attack, but use it for defense. Okay, number 4. With Jacob, let's recognize, call out to, and rely on the Lord to deliver his people in our times of need. When we have a need, our first response should be to cry out to our God. If we assume that we can do it by ourselves and that everything will work out, we are not really acknowledging that God's in control of all things, that he cares for us, and he has a great plan. Okay, number 5, from the words of Gad, God's people should be ready and on guard against those who wish to take from them and bring them harm. We are to pursue justice through the means by which God has provided. Number 6, from the words of Asher, we are called to acknowledge that the fruit of our labor comes from the Lord's hand, and we should enjoy what he has provided. Find joy, find happiness, what God has given you and provided, especially after hard work. And then finally, number 7, from the words of Naphtali, we are encouraged to share the blessings and the good things God has brought about in life. It's easy to share our needs and our troubles, which is something we should do. We should be carrying one another's burdens and weeping with those who weep, but we're also to rejoice with those who rejoice. So it should be a regular practice to share the good things that God is doing, to bring encouragement and to bring life as well. Okay, and that's the end of the parting words of Jacob, part 2. Does anyone have anything you want to add, or anything you want to ask, or any application that I missed?